Most people think gladiators walked into the Colosseum to die. That's the story Hollywood sold us. Savage men fighting to the death while crowds screamed for blood. But the truth is far stranger and more calculated than any film could capture. The real story involves economics, showmanship, and survival rates that would surprise you. Imagine standing beneath the streets of Rome in 80 AD, deep in a labyrinth of tunnels where daylight never reaches. You're surrounded by the smell of animal waste, human sweat, and fear. Above you, 65,000 people are stomping their feet, waiting for you to emerge. You're a gladiator, and contrary to everything you've been told, your owners desperately want you to survive. The Colosseum wasn't just built, it was engineered with a precision that still baffles architects today. Construction began in 72 AD under Emperor Vespasian and finished just 8 years later under his son Titus. 8 years to complete the largest amphitheatre ever constructed in the ancient world. The speed alone raises questions about Roman engineering capabilities that historians still debate. But here's what they don't tell you about its location. The Colosseum sits on top of what used to be Nero's personal artificial lake, part of his massive palace complex called the Domus Aurea. After Nero was deposed, Vespasian made a calculated political move. He drained Nero's private playground and built a public entertainment venue on the exact same spot. The message was clear. What once served one man's ego would now serve all of Rome. Beneath the arena floor lay the Hypogeum, a 2-level subterranean network of tunnels and chambers that functioned like backstage at a theatre. Except the performers were men who might die, and the stage effects included wild animals released through 80 vertical shafts. Elevators operated by a system of pulleys and counterweights lifted caged beasts directly into the arena. Trapdoors allowed scenery to appear and disappear. The Romans had created something between a battlefield and a Broadway production. To inaugurate this architectural marvel, Titus threw a celebration that lasted 100 days straight. Not a typo. 100 consecutive days of games. During this opening festival, over 9,000 wild animals were slaughtered. The inauguration alone killed more animals than most modern zoos house in their entire collections. But these games weren't just about spectacle, they were political weapons. The Romans called it bread and circuses, a formula for keeping the population content and distracted. Free tickets were distributed at gathering places like the Forum, carved into bone or terracotta, each one marked with an arch number and seating level. Your ticket told you exactly where you belonged in Roman society. Seating wasn't random. It was a physical manifestation of the class system. Senators sat closest to the action in marble seats. Behind them, the equestrian class. Higher up, common citizens. At the very top, women and the poorest Romans. Everyone could see the games, but everyone knew their place. The architecture itself reinforced social hierarchy. And the games served another purpose that gets overlooked. Romans were building an empire through constant military campaigns. Prisoners of war flooded into Rome by the thousands. What do you do with all these captives? You turn them into entertainment, into fighters, into a self-sustaining industry that both neutralizes potential rebels and generates massive profits. Which brings us to the gladiators themselves. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. People with nothing to lose, which made them perfect candidates for blood sports. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all gladiators were forced into the arena. Some were volunteers, free Roman citizens who signed contracts to fight. Why would anyone volunteer for potential death, fame, money? The same reasons people risk their lives today. A successful gladiator could become a celebrity. Women wrote graffiti about their favourite fighters on city walls. Children played gladiator games in the streets. The best fighters became household names across the empire. But becoming a gladiator meant entering a brutal training system that would make modern boot camps look gentle. New recruits were sent to specialised schools called ludi, run by wealthy investors called lanistas, who saw gladiators as assets to be developed and protected. These weren't random thugs hacking at each other. They were trained professionals being groomed for a very specific type of performance. The training equipment would be familiar to any modern athlete. Weights, balance beams, specialised apparatus for developing particular combat skills. But there was a twist that reveals just how calculated this system was. Training weapons were made of wood, just like you'd expect, except they weighed twice as much as real weapons. The gladiators trained with equipment so heavy that when they finally held actual combat weapons, they felt light and easy to maneuver. Every day, they'd strike a palace, a large wooden post, thousands of times, building muscle memory, perfecting technique, developing the strength needed to fight in heavy armor under the Mediterranean sun. And their living conditions, sleeping in cells, released only to train and eat. It sounds like prison because it was, but the food was surprisingly good and for a reason that had nothing to do with kindness. Gladiators consumed a high-carbohydrate diet focused on grains like barley and wheat. Archaeological analysis of their bones confirms this. They ate beans, lentils, vegetables, some fruit. What's notably missing? Meat. Despite being fighters, gladiators ate relatively little animal protein. The grain-heavy diet served a specific purpose, building a layer of fat beneath the skin. Not for appearance, but for protection. That subcutaneous fat could mean the difference between a superficial wound and a fatal cut. And here's what most people miss about gladiatorial combat. The system wasn't designed to kill these men quickly. It was designed to keep them alive as long as possible, while making their battles look spectacular enough to satisfy bloodthirsty crowds. Because training a gladiator was expensive, and dead gladiators generated no return on investment. The economics were ruthless. A lanista who owned a stable of gladiators had invested serious money into each fighter. Training costs, food, medical care, equipment. Losing a gladiator meant losing that entire investment. So the goal wasn't maximum carnage. It was maximum spectacle with minimum permanent damage. This is where the types of gladiators become crucial. There were over 24 different classes, each with distinct weapons, armour and fighting styles. The Mumio wore heavy armour, carried a large rectangular shield and fought with a gladius sword. Their helmet featured a distinctive fish-shaped crest. The Retiarius was the opposite. Minimal armour, armed with a trident and weighted net, relying entirely on speed and agility. These weren't random assignments. Matchmakers deliberately paired contrasting styles to create compelling drama. Speed versus strength. Armour versus mobility. The crowd loved watching a nimble Retiarius try to entangle a heavily armoured Circuiter. It was theatre as much as combat. And the fights themselves? Nothing like the chaotic bloodbaths Hollywood shows you. They were structured, almost choreographed in their progression. Referees monitored every bout. Doctors stood ready at the arena's edge. Rules governed what was and wasn't acceptable. Think of it less like a street fight and more like a regulated boxing match, except the stakes were considerably higher. Most gladiators fought about twice a year. Similar to modern boxers, actually. They trained for months for a single appearance. Their career typically lasted 5 years after a 2-year training period. Do the math, that's maybe 10 fights total for an average gladiator's entire career. But here's what changes everything about how we understand these contests. The mortality rate wasn't what you think. During the 1st century, a gladiator entering the arena had roughly a 10% chance of dying. If they were defeated, that risk jumped to 25%. Still not the guaranteed death sentence popular culture suggests. Why such relatively low mortality? Because the crowd wanted to see their favourites again. A gladiator who died couldn't provide future entertainment, couldn't build a rivalry with another fighter, couldn't develop the kind of ongoing narrative that kept audiences coming back. When a gladiator was clearly beaten, they could surrender by raising a single finger. The crowd would then signal their preference. Thumbs up for mercy, thumbs down for death. But even a thumbs down wasn't automatic execution. The sponsor of the games made the final call, and sponsors knew that killing popular fighters angered the crowd and damaged their own reputation. Most gladiators died young, sure. Average age at death was around 27. But that's counting everyone, including those who died in their first few fights. Some survived far longer. Records show gladiators who fought more than 150 bouts. Another died at 90 years old, long after retirement. 3 others lived to 38, 45 and 48. And the key was skill. a talented gladiator became too valuable to waste. They generated enormous revenue through betting, merchandise, and ticket sales. Women wrote graffiti about their favorite fighters. One piece of Pompeian wall art describes a gladiator as the girl's sigh. Children played gladiator games in the streets, mimicking famous fighters' signature moves. Which brings us to someone who understood this celebrity status better than anyone, Marcus Attilius. Unlike most gladiators, Attilius was free-born. He volunteered for the arena seeking fame and fortune. His first major fight was against Hilarius, an imperial gladiator who'd already won 12 of 14 bouts. Nobody gave Attilius a chance. He won anyway. Dominated the veterans so thoroughly that Hilarius surrendered. The upset was shocking enough, but Attilius wasn't done. His very next fight against Ratius Felix, another champion with 12 consecutive victories. Attilius beat him too. The Pompeian crowd went wild. Graffiti artists immortalized his back-to-back victories across the city's walls. And then, decades later, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried everything, accidentally preserving Attilius's legend in volcanic ash for modern archaeologists to discover. But the most famous gladiator story isn't about individual combat. It's about rebellion. Spartacus was a Thracian soldier who ended up enslaved and sent to a gladiator school in Capua. In 73 BC, he led an uprising that grew into a full-scale slave revolt. His army eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, defeating multiple Roman legions. When his lieutenant Crixus was killed in battle alongside 20,000 followers, Spartacus ordered 300 Roman soldiers slaughtered in his honor. The rebellion terrified Rome's ruling class because it exposed the brutal foundation their entire society rested on. Eventually, the Roman army crushed the uprising and killed Spartacus, but his story became legend precisely because it revealed how thin the line was between entertainment and insurrection. Then there's Spiculus, who shows how strange gladiatorial fame could get. In his debut fight, he faced Aptonetus, a veteran with 16 victories. Spiculus won, then killed his opponent. Emperor Nero was so impressed that he showered Spiculus with gifts, including an actual palace. Here's a man who was technically enslaved, yet lived in luxury with his own servants. When Nero faced rebellion and certain death in 68 AD, he asked Spiculus to execute him. Spiculus either refused or never got the message. Nero committed suicide instead, and afterward mobs tore down Nero's statues and used them to crush Spiculus to death, punishing him for his association with the despised emperor. Fame in the arena was a double-edged sword. It could elevate you beyond your station, but it could also destroy you just as quickly. The gladiators who survived longest were the ones who understood they were always performing, always one fight away from obscurity or death, always dependent on the crowd's fickle favour. Perhaps the most remarkable fight in gladiatorial history happened at the Colosseum's very first games in 80 AD. Two experienced fighters named Priscus and Verus faced each other during the 100-day inaugural celebration. These weren't novices. Both had survived multiple bouts, earned their reputations, knew every trick the arena could throw at them. The fight began, and continued, and continued. Hours passed. Neither man could gain advantage. The crowd watched two masters of their craft locked in perfect equilibrium, each counter met with another counter, each attack defended with precision. Eventually, both fighters did something almost unheard of. They simultaneously lowered their weapons and appealed to Emperor Titus, essentially agreeing to a draw. Titus was so impressed by their skill and mutual respect that he granted both men their freedom on the spot. The rudus, a wooden sword symbolizing manumission, was given to each fighter, one of the rarest outcomes in gladiatorial history, preserved because it happened at such a high-profile event. But not everyone who entered the arena earned such honor. Emperor Commodus represents the darkest side of gladiatorial obsession. Son of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Commodus ruled from 180 to 192 AD and personally fought in the Colosseum multiple times. Except he didn't fight fairly. He rigged every match, facing opponents who were handicapped, unarmed, or already wounded. He'd maim and kill them in deliberately sadistic displays while the crowd watched in uncomfortable silence. Roman society valued gladiatorial skill, but Commodus's participation scandalized everyone. Emperors weren't supposed to descend into the arena. It violated every social boundary Rome maintained between classes. Yet his obsession reveals just how intoxicating the spectacle had become, powerful enough to corrupt even the man at the apex of imperial power. The games themselves followed a brutal daily structure. Mornings featured animal hunts where exotic beasts from across the empire were slaughtered by the thousands. At the Colosseum's inauguration alone, over 9,000 animals died: lions, elephants, bears, leopards, shipped from Africa and Asia specifically to be killed for entertainment. Midday brought executions. Criminals were sent into the arena naked and unarmed to face the surviving animals, or forced to reenact myths where the protagonist dies horribly. Between these killings, burlesque comedies were performed. Actual comedy routines staged while blood still stained the sand, a bizarre intermission before the main event. Afternoons belonged to the gladiators. That's when the largest crowds gathered, when betting intensified, when the real spectacle began. Referees monitored the fights, doctors stood ready. Matchups were carefully arranged based on fighting style, experience, and crowd appeal. A heavily armoured Murmillo, with his fish-crested helmet and rectangular shield, might face a Retiarius armed only with a net and trident. Speed versus protection. Women fought too. By the 1st century AD, female gladiators had become common enough that specific regulations governed their participation. One marble relief from the 2nd century shows 2 women, Amazon and Achillea, fighting to an honourable draw. Their participation ended around 200 AD, when Emperor Septimius Severus banned women from the games. But for decades they'd proven themselves capable of the same brutal combat as their male counterparts. The Colosseum itself was an engineering marvel. Completed in just 10 years, it held 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, depending on configuration. Beneath the arena floor lay the hypogeum, a vast network of tunnels and chambers where gladiators, animals, and condemned prisoners waited. 80 vertical shafts connected these underground spaces to the arena above. Elevators and pulleys lifted caged beasts through trapdoors, creating dramatic surprise entrances. 1,000 sailors from the Imperial fleet operated the velarium, an enormous linen canopy that shielded spectators from the sun. These same sailors sprinkled perfumed water over the crowd during particularly hot days. Everything was designed for spectacle, for comfort, for maintaining the illusion that Rome cared about its citizens' entertainment. Because that's what the games really were: political theatre disguised as sport. Emperors used them to demonstrate power, to distract from economic problems, to remind everyone of Rome's dominance over the known world. Free tickets kept the population pacified. Bread and circuses, the oldest propaganda tool in the imperial handbook. The games continued for centuries, but they didn't end because of Christianity's rise, despite popular belief. They ended because Rome was collapsing. By the 5th century, the empire was fragmented and broke. Maintaining the Colosseum, paying for gladiators, importing exotic animals from distant provinces, all of it became impossibly expensive. The last recorded gladiatorial combat occurred in 435 AD. Animal hunts continued for another century, then those stopped too. The building fell into disrepair. Earthquakes damaged it. Stone was stripped for other construction projects. The elaborate underground machinery rusted and collapsed. The Colosseum became a monument to a fallen empire, a reminder of what Rome had been when it commanded the world's attention. But the gladiators themselves, the men and women who actually bled in that sand, left behind something more permanent than stone. They showed that even in humanity's darkest entertainments, skill could earn respect. That courage could transcend social status. That sometimes, just sometimes, 2 fighters could recognize each other's worth and refuse to provide the death the crowd demanded. The emperors are forgotten. The propaganda failed. But we still remember the names carved on Pompeii's walls, preserved by volcanic ash. Still study the bones that reveal their brutal training regimens. still wonder what it meant to walk into that arena knowing the odds, knowing the crowd's bloodlust, and choosing to fight anyway. The Colosseum stands today as a shell of its former self, but walk through those ancient corridors and you're walking where men calculated their survival against impossible odds. The stones remember what we've forgotten, that entertainment and economics have always been inseparable. That spectacle has always served power, and that the line between performance and reality has never been as clear as we pretend. We look back at gladiatorial combat with modern horror, convinced we're more civilized now. But are we? We still watch people destroy their bodies for our entertainment, still create celebrities from fighters, still segregate audiences by wealth, still use spectacle to distract from systemic problems. The technology changed, the underlying mechanics didn't. The gladiators knew something we've tried to forget, that survival isn't guaranteed, that skill matters more than strength, that the crowd's favour is fickle and fame is temporary. They understood the game because the stakes were absolute. Win and maybe you live. Lose and the decision isn't yours anymore. Every time you hear about gladiators fighting to the death, remember, the truth was more complicated and somehow more disturbing. They fought to survive in a system designed to profit from their blood while keeping them alive just long enough to fight again. That's not barbarism, that's economics. And we never really stopped playing the same game.